welcome everyone. Alberto, there's room here. We're just going to go out. Suddenly, come on in. But there is room at the table. She's not starting. Welcome to our REDS seminar, which is a joint project between Europe Center, helped out by Hoover, and CPRL. And we are delighted to have, I think you are our final REDS speaker in this series, which is REDS. Such a witty title, really. Oh, Anna says Rethinking European Development and Security, but it's spelled R-E-D-S. That's why you need the rethink. That's right, Russia. Every speaker in this series has had something to do with Russia, but not necessarily directly, just rethinking European development and security. And so today we are delighted to welcome Maria Popova from McGill University in Montreal, where she's science, and the director of the Grzymala-Busse Montreal. She's been in McGill since 2007. Where Harvard Department of Government, the Stanford of the East is what we call it here. I tried that out actually at Harvard last week, and I did not get the laughs I expected. There was sort of, well, you know how they are. And before that, Maria was at Dartmouth, but she grew up in Bulgaria before the fall of communism in 1989, and I think that also gives us some perspective on her work. She serves currently not only as a professor of political science, but she is the editor of the Cambridge Element series on politics and society from Central Europe to Central Asia. Generally, her work, it falls beautifully in with CDRL, so you should come here on leave sometime, actually. It explores the rule of law and democracy in Eastern Europe. Her first book was called Politicized Justice in Emerging Democracies, and it won the American Association for Ukrainian Studies Book Prize in 2013. And it examines the weaponization of law to manipulate elections and control the media in Russia and Ukraine. More recent articles have focused on judicial and anti-corruption reform in the post-2014 Ukraine, and the politics of anti-corruption in Eastern Europe. And illiberalism more generally. Her new book with Oksana Shevel, who is also a friend of the program, came here last year, you might remember, to talk about Ukraine, is on the roots of the Russo-Ukrainian War, and it's called Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States. I just brought it here as a stage prop. She's not actually going to talk about that today, although you could, but you're not going to. And that just came out in the last year or so. I think that's all I have to say, actually, other than welcome. We so much appreciate you flying all the way from the other corner of the continent, my homeland. I don't know that but I myself am Canadian. And it is a different country, isn't it? Yes, right. So welcome. Thanks, Maria. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to hear what is going to be not really a full-fledged I'm going to try to sell you on an argument, but a bunch of ideas that I have been thinking about related, some of them coming out from my previous work on and ongoing work on anti-corruption, and hopefully I'm going to get some ideas from you about how to then develop this into a more complete project, because this is really the beginning. And it starts from this question of whether, now that Ukraine is in accession negotiations to join the EU, you've probably all heard this question being asked in some sort of version of it. Is Ukraine too corrupt to be in the EU? Really, that's one of the central questions about EU accession. It comes up all the time in the context of accession. Some of the conditions that Ukraine has gotten have to do with both anti-corruption and judicial reforms. And the main question is sort of how serious is the problem with corruption in Ukraine. And I started thinking about, given that now this is a main issue of accession, sort of how does Ukraine's level of corruption right now that it has started negotiations, how does it compare to the most recent EU entrants, which are Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia, when they started their negotiations for accession in 2000 for Bulgaria and Romania, and 2005 for Croatia. And I've done a lot of work on corruption reforms and anti-corruption in Bulgaria and Romania and Croatia. And once I started thinking about this question, sort of a bit of a puzzle emerged. On the one hand, there are multifaceted similarities between these three countries and Ukraine in how I'll describe some of those similarities. But on the other hand, the corruption perception indices that we have, which is really the main thing that we use to measure corruption, suggest that Ukraine is more corrupt than the other three, and in quite a significant way. So there's a bit of a puzzle that comes out of this. What to make of this joint? So the type of similarities that I'm noting between these countries have to do with the anti-corruption institutional architecture in place in all those four countries, have to do with corruption salience in the media and in public discourse, quite similar in the four countries, and with the type of corruption revelations and the focus of where the locus of corruption, and here really I should make the clarification that for most of this talk, what I have in mind is grand, high-level political corruption rather than petty administrative corruption, which is kind of I think a separate issue that is less, how we measure that is less problematic. Here I'm talking about the high-level grand corruption. And in all these four countries, the type of scandals by their nature, the focus of how grand corruption works and where the weak spots are also quite similar. So, so if you were to completely sort of shelf the corruption perception indicators and forget that you've ever seen them, you might look at these four countries and conclude that they have similar levels of corruption. Let me start with the institutional structure. Now, Ukraine has created an extensive anti-corruption institutional architecture really in the last 10 years, mostly between 2015 and 2019. So they have adopted, they have created from scratch institutions at every sort of stage of the corruption tackling process, of the anti-corruption process. At the prevention stage, you have the National Agency for Prevention of Corruption, created in 2016. At the investigation stage, you have the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, created in 2015, and the State Bureau of Investigations. At the prosecution stage, you have a specialized anti-corruption prosecution office, created in 2015, and more recently, a high anti-corruption court. And then once corruption has been uncovered, punished, There's also an asset recovery institution created in 2016. Now, the results of how are these sort of anti-corruption institutions actually operating? Now, there's some mixed results in at the stage of investigation, and prosecution, some competition between NABU and SA. There have been sort of entrenched interests trying to compromise the independence of these institutions, some interagency competition, some controversies over who is leading them, but basically these are active institutions. The best results that we have are really in prevention. The asset declaration system that's run by the National Agency for Corruption Prevention since 2016. It was suspended for a time during the war, but it has now been restarted, is a major element of the success after Maidan. And the even bigger success is the PROZO e-procurement system, which was introduced by public-private partnership in 2016. It received multiple international public procurement awards from the OECD. It has been universally praised as quite innovative, and it has produced absolutely tangible results. Budget savings, potentially up to 20%, according to some studies. It has introduced 250,000 new bidders into the system. 90% of them small, medium sized businesses. And it has earned significant levels of trust with Ukrainian society. Up to 2/3 of Ukrainians and more, or 3/4, trust PROZO. When you look at how the different functioning of the different institutions is assessed by the anti-corruption sort of global anti-corruption regime actors, the international actors. Here I have a little table that shows that there is some variation, as I said, mixed results among the different institutions. For example, the asset recovery agency is probably not working as well. As I mentioned, the NABU and the specialized prosecution have been sort of competing with each other, and that has an effect on their assessment. But the anti-corruption, the high anti-corruption court has been significantly well received and it seems to be doing a good job. So when you look at the big picture, you have in the last 10 years, enormous institutional creation, some very positive results, and some political competition around some of the institutions trying to harness it for political goals versus the institutions trying to create a measure of independence. So that's kind of the big picture story of Ukraine. And then we look at how things are in the countries that are already members of the EU. And we look at these three countries and we see that some of them don't actually have the same, they don't have the full institutional architecture. And in others, some portions of it actually failed. And were closed down. So one thing to note here is when these countries were starting accession negotiations, they didn't have the institutional infrastructure that Ukraine currently has. They, all of the similar institutions that do exist were created around the same time as the Ukrainian institutions were created in the 2010s. And I'll explain later why I think this is important, because it has to do with sort of a global spread of anti-corruption institutions rather than with a local process. But for example, you look at the situation in Bulgaria and you see that the Anti-Corruption Commission wasn't created until 2018, more than 10 years after Bulgaria joined the EU. There was a specialized prosecution and a specialized criminal court created in 2011. So a few years after Bulgaria was already in the EU. But both of those institutions quickly became so politically compromised that by 2022, the anti-corruption reformers were calling for the abolition of these institutions rather than for their strengthening. And in fact, in 2022, both of these institutions were disbanded. There may be a restart, but we don't know yet. And at this point, we have a story in Bulgaria of these anti-corruption institutions that basically failed. There is also a National Council on Anti-Corruption Policies created in 2015, but that council, even though it still exists on paper, has not really been active since 2017. So it was active for a couple of years, hasn't produced any result at this point. Basically, there is no information about what they're doing since about 2019. Apparently, they haven't met since 2019. So part of the institutions officially disbanded. Another part basically went into inaction. In Romania, we have sort of a much more successful story with the National Anti-Corruption Directorate, the DNA, created around the time of accession, but not before. So Ukraine, again, is here in a different position. It's already had its institution for 10 years before starting accession. In Romania, really, it's a result, this creation was a result of the accession negotiations. The DNA and the National Integrity Agency have both been quite successful. Romania, especially in the mid 2010s, had a major anti-corruption campaign prosecuted by the DNA. Eventually, so a lot of oligarchs and high-level politicians were brought to justice. Eventually, there was some backlash against the Romanian anti-corruption institutions. They have been somewhat curtailed in their power, but they're still functioning. And Romania does have similar to Ukraine's Pozoro system, or rather the asset declaration system, a system for identifying conflicts of interest in public procurement, which is similar to the Ukrainian case. In Croatia, again, we have some of these institutions created around the time of the accession, some of them way later in the same time period as Ukraine, but a fairly similar picture in terms of institutional architecture in anti-corruption. So, when we hear that Ukraine has a massive corruption problem, and in order to enter into the EU, they have to now work on it, it's missing this part of the story that they already have the institutional architecture in place. Now, the other similarities between the four countries is that if you do any research in all those four countries, you would immediately know that corruption is is probably the top issue of salience in all of these countries. So if you look at, I just pulled random, obviously that has to, much more systematic work is needed here to prove this point, but a tiny illustration from some Eurobarometer data on Bulgaria, Croatia, and Romania shows that in all three countries, there is a widespread portion of the population that thinks that corruption is a major problem. And in fact, significant portions of the population think that corruption is increasing. Another similarity is that the scandals that received wide coverage are very similar in all four countries. I won't go into a lot of detail because I see I'm really running out of time fast. But basically, you see very similar scandals about major issues within the judiciary, fixers and brokers in the judiciary that are helping these corrupt networks engage in endemic corruption. These are from time to time broken up. Some of these fixers and brokers sort of lose their positions, both in Ukraine. That has happened recently to a judge on the in Kyiv who was sort of famous for this. Same stories in Bulgaria, for example. There was a notary who was gunned down, and once he was murdered, all this information about his role and in fixing corrupt deals came to the fore. If you look at the corruption perceptions indices, however, you will see that Ukraine tracks as significantly more corrupt than the other three countries on all types of indices that they have: regime corruption, public sector corruption, executive corruption, political corruption. However you look at it, but in grand corruption, in the two top, it is especially, even though you see a clear improvement in Ukraine since 2014, it's still in a different league from the other three countries. And that really is a puzzle. It raises some measurement and theoretical implications for how to explain this. I mean, one possibility, of course, is maybe I'm sort of exaggerating this. It's not really a puzzle. The nature of post-communist grand corruption is similar. That's why we observe similar scandals. That's why society is similarly concerned, and sort of the salience of corruption is similarly high. But truly, the degree of corruption is very different, and that's captured well by the indices. That's one possibility. But another possibility is that perception indices don't really capture the reason for this difference that we observe, is that they don't capture either corruption incidents or corruption perceptions all that well. And I'm not the first one, of course, to say this. There is a significant literature out there that is critiquing the indices for various conceptual and measurement problems. I won't go over all the different critiques, but I will point out that this puzzle that I'm noting actually suggests a problem that is generally overlooked. That's not part of the existing critiques. A new critique, if you will. That the indices are really fundamentally non-comparative. Why are they non-comparative? Because basically, the experts who are polled on these indices are really tracking the country that they know. And so the result of this is that they're not really comparing very similar countries to each other. They're comparing their country over time and comparing it to the conceptual definition that they're working with. Now, some of the defense of the sort of the main way in which the perception indices have been defended is that there is significant evidence of correlation between expert assessments and local population perceptions, and also between population perceptions and population and the reported experience by local population. However, both of these may well be true, but one thing I'll note is that this defense and this study, which is really good, has to do though with administrative corruption mostly, because that's the corruption where you can track individual local population experience. You're not going to be able to have a local measure of grand corruption because you're simply not going to actually poll the people who engage in it. One thing is that this defense of the indices has to do with how well they measure low-level administrative corruption. But for grand corruption, the other problem is that even if we can be fairly confident that the experts are capturing what is the situation on the ground, the issue is that the situation on the ground is, in fact, locally constructed. So if there is a narrative locally that the country is highly corrupt, then the experts are going to catch that narrative, and because they don't actually compare it with other countries, they're not going to be able to actually distinguish whether whether the size of the corruption problem or the intensity of it is the same or fundamentally different from some similar countries. In this way, countries may actually get locked into levels of perception, both by their local populations and by the experts who are watching things and assessing. Now, there's some theoretical implications from this issue. The first one, I think, and this is kind of the novel idea that I think I have, but I have to think about how to explore, is that there is an underappreciated temporal dimension here. EU accession, corruption perceptions, and anti-corruption policies are not independent variables as we perceive them to be. What do I mean by this? I mean, first I mean that EU accession, we only have the part of the story which says EU accession depends on your corruption, but really it depends on your perceived level of corruption. However, it may actually go also the other way. If you did not make it through EU accession in the first round, it may affect the way in which you're scored for your corruption problem. Because the Copenhagen criteria are claiming that control of corruption is a major a major hoop that countries have to jump through. in order to get into the EU. If the countries are not in the EU, it's much easier to then assess them as more corrupt, because the relationship could really go both ways. In addition, anti-corruption policies and the global anti-corruption regime really emerged after EU enlargement already started. The Copenhagen criteria is in '93, but all of this institutional infrastructure for anti-corruption doesn't come around anywhere until really the 2010s. And this is where these institutions start spreading. So that has to be also factored in. And the third part that has to be factored in and looked at more seriously, I think, is geopolitics. Because we've really come to think that EU enlargement was a fully meritocratic process. That's sort of been kind of accepted. But as opposed to a geopolitical process. However, I think we have to go back now and maybe try to establish whether geopolitics, in fact, may have mattered more than we think. So to turn what is currently being argued that Ukraine is now getting a geopolitical priority because it is now people realize that it's important for Ukraine to be in the EU, and that's why they're going to overlook its corruption. Turn this on its head and think, is it possible that assessment of corruption levels back in the 90s and early 2000s were in fact endogenous to geopolitical factors, and that because it was much easier to say we're not going to put you on the fast track towards EU accession because you have a sizable corruption problem, versus to say, well, we don't want to piss off Russia. So I think we're due for some sort of reassessment of the importance of geopolitics in EU enlargement. And I'll just note that if we look at the indices, we'll see that going through the waves of EU accession, each subsequent wave had a higher average of corruption. Basically, the first countries that got in were less corrupt. I mean, there's some outliers in each group or some variation in each group, but for each group, for each next wave, there was a higher corruption score. And for the current wave that Ukraine is in, Ukraine is kind of at the average. But the question is whether this sort of this development over time, how do we in fact conceive of it? Do we conceive of it as well, they started meritocratically, first accepted the most obvious cases, now these next cases are iffy precisely because they have more serious corruption, or is it possible that it goes the other way? So finally, I'll just end with this sort of, if perception indices might be problematic, then what do we do? Because it's not easy. One of the reasons why they're so widespread is because they are capturing something that is easy to work with. Well, we'll need to just redouble efforts to find some cross-national objective indicators, and at least start with some small n comparisons, like the one that I'm thinking of starting here, but using some objective indicators as opposed to the perceptions indices. And I'll end here since I definitely went over time. Thank you.
It's my turn to manage the questions, and they're starting. Great, Eric.
Maria, thank you for this presentation. It's really interesting because I read these perception indexes and I wonder compared to what, and you're doing that comparison, which is much needed. I wonder the extent to which, I don't know if you've worked on this, the extent to which international participation in the appointments process, for example, for the high corruption court, makes a difference in the perceptions. Certainly, Ukrainians are trying to proliferate this international model, this hybrid international model, where their internationals are on the appointments panel. But they're running out of, they've got so many appointments that it's a very difficult model to measure. But I just wonder the extent to which international participation in the appointments may have influenced perceptions.
Yeah, it's a very good question because it seems that precisely the Ukrainian push to include international experts in every single to have these public integrity councils attached to each of these institutions precisely has to do with the fact that Ukrainian civil society and Ukrainian decision makers both realize that Ukraine has a huge perception problem to overcome, not only for the international community to start seeing them as less corrupt because these international experts are involved, but also for Ukrainians, because basically one of the problems with the perceptions is they're really sticky, and they start constituting what people perceive to be the level of corruption. So it is very hard to figure out how you can sort of step out of it, given that every single sort of decision could be interpreted as either progress or maybe a nefarious step by somebody else.
So thank you for that. The perception index is kind of known to be problematic, just the way it's obtained and all of that. So there are just some other thoughts, and then I want to make a comment about developed countries. So Yuan Ang has the idea of breaking up corruption to 2 by 2, and she's done that on a few countries that have to do with elite versus et cetera, and small theft versus bargains, and so. Then there are other global projects, such as, the Rule of Law Project, and they rank a lot of, so that's basically created by Newcomb, and they, that, and I was just looking up their index, but they have different buckets of things, including sort of corruption. So, I was kind of curious about the use of the word corruption, which is not always, like in the US, it's, it's sort of wire fraud. It's like, it comes under different statutes that don't mention the word corruption necessarily. So I'm not quite sure if the word corruption in the law is really the only thing. There's sort of, you're trying to capture stuff like that. And then, of course, in the context of the US, one has to mention that there are now multiple books about US corruption, and they take the form of legal corruption oftentimes. We do have Menendez now in trouble, but we had the unanimous Supreme Court decision on the Virginia governor, which is very sobering in the sense that they count that as normal politics in the US to receive significant gifts from this business person. And that was considered, just like all of us, excess our policymakers. It's pretty outrageous, actually, when you think about it. So what I mean to suggest with that is US and also some European, EU developed nations, one could define measures of corruption by which they have more corruption than they would like to believe.
No, absolutely. I think that's part of the indices not really being truly comparative, because I'll give a Canadian example just for Kathryn. If you look at Canada's ranking in VDEM, it's a flat line. It's a very clean country, but also a flat line. And I've lived in Canada for 20 years now, and we've had a bunch of corruption scandals. they never register on the perception index. Why do they not register? A lot of them are not talked about in terms of corruption. As you said, right now in Canada, there is a major scandal that has to do with the fact, and for anyone who reads news about Eastern Europe, once I describe it, you will start screaming corruption. There was a public contract given to a company to create an app for people to register their COVID status arriving at the airport. It's called Arrive Can. The contract was supposed to be $80,000. It ended up costing $60 million. So it went from 80,000 to 60 million. It turned out that the contract was given to a company with 2 employees that does not have an address, but a PO box. And the 2 employees of this company are de facto grant writers. They outsource, they get the government contracts, they outsource them to other companies and obviously take a pay cut. It's a major scandal, but the word corruption has not been used once. It's malfeasance, waste of public funds. If that happened in Ukraine, I mean, end of story. But it has to do, but I think this is not only a problem because it's a double standard, but because it affects the way we score corruption and perceive corruption, both for the experts and for the local population. So the some of the good studies that are defending the corruption indices points to a good correlation between the experts and the local population. Well, that doesn't mean anything. Yes, they all believe that conceptualization. So the experts are pretty good.
I guess continuing on this theme of defining grand corruption, there's a burgeoning literature on transnational corruption arguing that grand corruption is a problem in thinking of oligarchies in places like Ukraine, precisely because the public knows that economic elites are able to buy power and policy that they want, and also to circumvent a lot of laws by keeping all of their wealth abroad. And that's enabled by professional financial centers in the West. But there's no way of capturing this in any kind of corruption index. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a serious issue. But something that I think maybe in the Ukrainian case and through the EU accession process is going to be less emphasized, because basically the global corrupt networks are the Russian oligarchs that had a foothold in Ukraine, but they have been significantly weakened by the war. And so we'll see how it goes, but it is definitely a really important dimension to this, because both the anti-corruption regime is also global in the sense of what is perceived to be a good institution. There have been these norms that have developed in the last 10, 15 years about having to have a specialized prosecution, a specialized court. Now, a lot of these courts necessarily to have an international component at the appointment stage. So yeah, so all of this is being sort of developed right now.
On the perception, I just wanted to mention briefly that in crime perceptions also they often are uncorrelated with crime statistics, so that's something to do. The point I was going to make is, so the efforts by Ukraine to stamp on corruption starts after 2014, which is also when Donbass and Crimea started. So I was wondering, and so basically Ukrainian nationalism comes to the fore, and so to what extent is it the timing of this coincide with an effort to counter Russian interests that can penetrate Russian society through corruption? Is that Because that might color the way Europeans see this anti-corruption.
I mean, it's definitely related. The major progress has been achieved since 2014, but corruption salience has been high in Ukraine way before that. Because basically the Orange Revolution was also about, getting rid of corruption. And in fact, that was the major promise of the Orange Coalition that they didn't clearly deliver on. The part of the reason why the post-2014 progress was much more significant is both because it was now embedded into the process of European conditionality, because Euromaidan was over signing this association agreement with the EU, right? That was the trigger, the main reason for this entire mobilization. And once it's succeeded in Ukraine, in the central government, that association agreement was signed. And it was an association agreement that included a conditionality component. In other words, Ukrainians were supposed to meet some targets in order to receive parts of sort of visa-free travel, which they eventually did, and different parts of this association agreement. So it is very much intertwined with the EU accession process, and also with the fact that some of the basically the major political actors connected to Russia that were opposed to this anti-corruption process were basically marginalized politically, because a big part of their, first because the Yanukovych party of regions collapsed and he left, so that was part of it, but also the remnants of it now had constrained electoral support, both because people turned away from Russia and because some of the most pro-Russian voters were simply removed from Ukrainian elections through the occupation by Russia.
Yeah, so this is really fascinating. I'm old enough to remember how excited we were when Transparency International started the corruption. And it was very important at that moment, because the World Bank was driving a lot of these efforts, and there was all these indexes, for example, about doing business in different countries. And the big merit of Transparency International in that moment was that they would ask the same businessmen doing business over 20 countries. So the idea was to anchor these perceptions, not just on what country experts themselves thought. Now, that is something that was lost along the way. And it was lost along the way to some extent because there was a lot of criticism about how driven by economics this was, instead of more driven by politics and driven by all these grand corruption that are very different from what businessmen could do. So one question for you is whether we have to go back to this original spirit of how, because that's why it was exciting when it started. It was this idea that it was not just a bunch of country specialists, but actually, and these things were actually correlated with what people actually knew, and that was really surprising. We thought this is great. Second question, a little bit just kind of unrelated, but it is the way people think about how to deal with endogeneity is usually what kind of natural experiment could you have. So the best one I know in the world is really the CICIG in Guatemala, which was an actual kind of international, semi-sovereignty, Krasner would tell us, this is the kind of thing that happened. And that kind of experiment, would something like that be possible in a place like Ukraine?
Thank you. I think it's definitely a great idea to go back and ask the people who are involved, sort of businessmen, and I mean, that still would get at the administrative corruption more than the really grand corruption, and it's not super likely that we're going to be able to get this from, you know, the members of parliament and the judges and the investigators who are kind of, but maybe from the businessmen who are dealing with these networks, we can get some information. But I think what's really crucial, and maybe that's the difference between the moment then and now, is how people conceive of what do they call the same practices in different contexts. And so when Transparency was asking this in the mid-90s, corruption was really not that salient. In some way, in a way, they were defining what constitutes corruption. Now, because I'm afraid that if you go to a Canadian businessman and ask him about, like, do you give bribes? Do you, do you buy influence? He would always say no, because that's not how they conceive of what they're actually doing. So I think what we need to go back to the drawing board is to identify these practices that we may try to agree on, capture the phenomena that we want to measure, and then maybe go back to people and ask them in some neutral new language. Do you do X, Y, and Z without calling it corruption, bribes, malfeasance, whatever?
So thank you for this. I am super skeptical about these perception indexes. I think what you just said is right, that the transparency index was really businessmen who actually did know if they were asked to pay a bribe, so they could report on that. That's kind of administrative. But, you know, what kind of expert knows that the president of the country took a huge bribe, put it in a Swiss bank account, completely hidden from, I mean, what constitutes expertise, in that sort of thing? It seems to me there's a couple of other things you could look at, like, is there an active civil society movement? And in Ukraine, there is one. I mean, there's a lot of organizations that want to police corruption, but probably less in Bulgaria and other places. The other thing is, you could look at how many convictions these anti-corruption bodies actually get. Now, but even that's complicated. So Romania, you had these really powerful female anti-corruption fighters like Monica Macovei and Laura Kövesi. And who's the judge that we had as a summer fellow? Yeah, okay, she's a little wacky. And they actually, they put away a prime minister and several Ukraine never did anything like that. But then it turned out that these people retained their power. They went after these women.
There she is, texting in. Yeah.
But these powerful politicians pursued the anti-corruption fighters back. They got them out of Romania and destroyed their careers. And so the final story is really complicated. And, I just don't see how a quote unquote expert really captures that, especially over time, the way these things develop.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I actually have I was writing a book on the politics of corruption prosecutions in Bulgaria and Romania in the fall of 21, which has been shelved because of the war in Ukraine. But I have actually all the data on Bulgaria and Romania on anti-corruption prosecutions, and basically for high level, for cabinet minister rank, basically. And the story is fascinating because both countries have a really high indictment rate. So about between 15 and 20% of all cabinet ministers who served from 2000 to 2020 faced corruption prosecutions in both countries. But the conviction rate is extremely different. The conviction rate in Bulgaria is 0. Every single person put on trial was acquitted, to the point that when news scandals broke down, broke out, people who were the subject of those scandals would say, "Put me on trial, please, because I would like to prove my innocence." It is really good track record. In Romania, on the other hand, there was a whole, at some point, people were joking that there's a full cabinet behind bars. Every representative of every portfolio, one of them was not simply convicted, but in fact received effective sentences. But you're absolutely right that, first of all, there was enormous backlash against the Romanian success. And Kövesi had to go to the European level and become the European prosecutor. And in Bulgaria, it had the effect of completely discrediting the entire anti-corruption process. I mean, that's why we see that these institutions were closed down, because they didn't achieve anything. They became a laughingstock. But you look at the corruption perceptions index, that story is not in any way represented in their, this went.
Are you able to turn it back on back there? Yep, they're doing it.
Because if you look, oh, I thought I had it. Yeah, I think I have it here. But if you look at the, so Bulgaria is the blue and Romania is the green. I mean, the Bulgarian story is some sort of variation, which is not really connected to anything. At least the Romanian story is one of decline, which is captured, because they did do significant.
So in the Romanian case,
Yeah.
those politicians that were jailed discovered there was a loophole in the law that if they were writing a book, they could get early release on their sentences. So they all hired people to write books for them, and they all got out early.
Is this a sabbatical?
What's even more interesting is that a lot of the lower level politicians, or mayors, and some who were convicted, served time in prison. They got out, they ran, and they won their seats back, because basically voters didn't really punish them for.
We may have a case of that here.
Yeah.
Well, mindful of repercussions from higher powers, Kathryn is next.
So I have one really short question, and then just one quick comment, which is, yeah, so it's really hard to find the right measure other than perceptions, which is presumably why they settled on this, right? But they're sticky. But you could look, I mean, you could look at indictments, yes, but the problem there is that you could be perceived as really corrupt if you actually have a lot of indictments and convictions. So you're trying to clean it up, and it's getting cleaner, but you look more corrupt as you do that. Or you can look really clean, like, you know, Putin could score very high in Russia when innocent people are being accused of corruption. So that's very hard as well, right? You could look at it seems to me you could look at a financial effect, or you could look at a policy outcome if you can disentangle it, right? So it's hard to take corruption out from just bad governance, although the two are not unrelated. Like you could look at the amount of spending per capita on something like healthcare and then the outcomes. But then, you know, if you look at the US, is it corruption? In a sense, it kind of is with insurance companies, right? You spend a lot and don't get as good outcomes as other. Anyway, so it's very hard to think of the right spending, the right measure. What I was just going to ask you a simple question though. Why is Georgia not ever in this conversation? Because they obviously had a huge anti-corruption. It's not one of your cases, so I'm just interested to know why.
They haven't opened negotiations yet.
So
They've just been recognized as a candidate.
Okay.
But they haven't opened negotiations. But
so you're waiting until they open negotiations.
But if I end up going in the direction of thinking about geopolitics and how that affects the whole bundle,
fits
then
your case.
obviously Georgia would have to be.
I have a two-finger on that one.
Yeah.
You know, it strikes me that in almost all the places that you talked about, the anti-corruption institutions were founded after these countries acceded to the EU. Ukraine is the exception, right? It has all the institutions in place before it's attempting to enter. And then we have this paradoxical perverse effect that, they have these institutions, so they must have a serious problem. Plus there's greater reporting that then actually increases the salience of this. So in a way, they might be kind of hoisted on their own petard of basically setting up the institutions before they were told to by the EU.
Absolutely. I mean, that's part of the problem, but also at the same time, also all of these institutions were sort of invented after some of these countries already joined. So some of the question that raises is those countries that got in before, like in the very first, that they opened negotiations in '98. The corruption criteria looked very different in '98 than it looks now. In the sense that there is just so much more understanding of how corruption works.
So remember what Alberto said, right? So 95 and Wilkinson suddenly discovers that corruption exists with the World Bank, and that's when the huge wave is launched. I mean, it's literally in the mid-90s, that's like all they're talking about, and that really affects the first wave. It doesn't affect the subsequent waves, which are all about administrative capacity and living up to democracy and blah, blah, blah. So I don't know, anyway,
Yeah,
that's something to
look at. Yeah, for sure.
Great. I enjoyed this very much. So I'm just so one of the things I found kind of most striking, and I think one of the things that you just kind of set up the paradox was that I think in maybe the second or third slide you showed that Croatia sort of local perceptions of corruption in Croatia were like 93%, right? And I haven't spent that much time in Croatia, apart from like a handful of sort of holidays and such, and anyway, Ukraine meanwhile was
far doesn't count.
What's that?
Far doesn't count.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so I guess I was sort of trying to think about how one might reconcile those, those local perceptions with kind of the VDEM expert indices, and sort of one way it seemed to me was that partly, how one would explain kind of the divergence in local perceptions is that these are sort of driven by the set of kind of comparison countries against which one kind of judges kind of one's own country, right? And so that would be then kind of a different way that a EU accession and corruption perceptions would be endogenous to each other, right? They could be endogenous at the local level too in this case, right? And so then I was thinking about is there sort of right? So then we sort of have expert indices are biased in the sense that sort of experts focus on one country over time, and and kind of local perceptions are biased, maybe because like they're focused kind of less on kind of changes over time, but instead on kind of a comparison set of countries, kind of more kind of more cross-sectional in some sense. So then I was thinking about whether there's some some way to sort of think about one set of perceptions, i.e. local or sort of expert as being kind of more or less biased, and kind of which direction that might go. Then Frank's comment sort of got me thinking about kind of other proxy measures that maybe one could use to kind of sort of help sort of arbitrate that. And I guess then I was sort of thinking about investigative journalism funding, activity, et cetera, right? Anyway, so that's kind of like this kind of long, kind of comment, some direction, some sort of directed, maybe undirected. But yeah, I guess sort of in general, is there a way to think about which set of kind of correct perceptions, local versus expert, are more biased, and then again, sort of how you might adjudicate that?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, some sort of measure of how much the media talks about corruption must go into this, in the sense that if you are in a media environment, and actually Grigor Popelekis and Graham Robertson have a recent article that suggests that they're focused on something else, but it does suggest that people who consume media more are more likely to actually have kind of a response to corruption-related issues, corruption-related reforms, and so of course the media primes the local respondents to perceive the corruption that they supposedly encounter.
We've seen with crime, like Marcel's point.
Yeah, so media, yeah. I think media would have to go into that, and sort of the tone of the media, whether the tone of the coverage is constantly, we are the worst, most corrupt country in the EU, we're so bad. I mean, you repeat this often enough, people are going to perceive corruption everywhere they look. The same, like for example, one example recently from Ukraine was that I was hearing from a lot of the people that I keep in touch with that there was major corruption in the military recruitment centers, like vast, everybody's giving bribes and getting out of service. And then every time though, when I ask them, but do you know of someone who actually did that? They never know of someone. They've heard of it and they're sure it must be going on. But that is really very much primed by, if you keep hearing over and over and over that you are living in a hugely corrupt country, the most corrupt in Europe, blah, 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 you're gonna believe every allegation.
Sure. I buy very much the limitations to these expert perception indices, and I sympathize with how difficult it is to measure something that's basically unobservable until it's observed. And so
That's profound.
So I had a similar thought to Alberto around the ease of business, but is there something to the possibility of measuring rather than actual observed corruption, opportunities for corruption? So this might not vary as much over time, like in short periods of time. And this, I don't know to what extent these expert indices try to do this, but if there are like institutional dimensions, enforcement metrics, budgetary dimensions that you could capture that offer like the ease of business, but like an ease of corruption that might be a little bit more suitable for cross-country comparison.
That's one of the things is if more countries adopted the e-procurement system that Ukraine has invented, we would have a really good cross-country comparison, because we'll know sort of the size of the savings is going to be suggestive of how serious corruption was to begin with. Apparently, Ukraine is saving like 20% that was going in kickbacks, presumably before that. But if the savings and from this fully transparent system end up being only 5%, maybe that would be a way. But I'll have to look more into it. But it seems that right now Ukraine has really is really a leader in this e-procurement, because it's so accessible to everyone. You can see everything, so it has had a profound effect. But in the other cases, it's not even implemented. So
I guess if you define like some general, because there's the procurement and contracts, but there's also quid pro quos, which might be the hardest thing to observe. But like, lobbying is legal, and under some definitions in this country, and some definitions, like you can purchase policy, right?
Researchers are never going to be as smart as the politicians and the bureaucrats.
That's true.
Figuring out.
That's true. But it might be better. It might be better than like, do you think, to Frank's point, that might be closer to the truth.
One thing that I'm thinking about is actually tracking murders of legal actors, because if you have multiple cases over and over of notaries getting murdered in mafia hits, not a good sign of how the system is working, right?
Yes.
And that is happening in Bulgaria, for example, with a fairly regularly. So, I mean, on the other hand, the murders signal some sort of competition over it. If the system is super well oiled, everybody's getting their cuts and nobody's getting murder. So yeah, pros and cons to everything.
And on that awfully morbid note, I know we have some questions, but in the interest of time, thank you so much, Maria, and thank you everyone for coming.